I never thought that betrayal could hide in plain sight inside the same house where I folded laundry with care, watered my plants on Sunday afternoons, and believed that marriage vows meant forever. But one morning, while carrying out what should have been the most ordinary routine, I stumbled upon a truth that shook me harder than any storm ever could. My husband wasn't only cheating on me, he was planning to bring his mistress into our home, into the very walls that held my photographs, my memories, my late-night whispers, and the scent of every meal I had ever cooked for him. If you have ever lived through the pain of realizing someone you trusted the most was capable of turning your life into a cruel stage for their selfish games, you know the way my chest tightened that morning, the way silence screamed louder than words. And before I take you further into this story, let me just say this. If you're listening right now while maybe sipping your coffee, doing the dishes, or driving through traffic, please tap the like button or leave me a little comment. It may seem small, but it truly gives me the strength to share these stories, and it makes me feel like you and I are walking through them together. My name is Claire Whitman. I'm 34 years old. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood where every driveway looks freshly swept, every porch lined with flower pots, and neighbors wave at each other as if nothing bad could ever happen behind closed doors. I used to be the woman who baked muffins for school fundraisers, sent out Christmas cards with handwritten notes, and believed that a happy family was simply the reward of hard work, patience, and kindness. My husband David and I had been married for nearly 10 years, and from the outside, we looked like a perfect pair. He was charming in that polished way that made him the favorite at office parties, and I was the supportive wife who laughed at his jokes and pretended not to notice when his eyes lingered too long on other women. But reality is not the same as a family portrait. The truth is painted in smaller strokes, in receipts shoved into pockets, in late-night text messages, in excuses that sound too polished, in a tone of voice that says more than the words themselves. For months, I tried to believe the excuses. I told myself that his business trips really were urgent, that his sudden need for the gym late at night was about health, not lust. I convinced myself that if I just stayed patient, if I just loved harder, things would come back to what they once were. That morning, though, there was no longer any room for denial. I had borrowed his phone, not to snoop, but to hand it to him while he showered. A notification lit up the screen. The sender's name was saved simply as Honey. The words were short and bold. Can't wait to move in. Lunch today to plan everything. My blood froze and my fingers trembled. It wasn't just infidelity anymore. It wasn't a fling hidden behind closed doors. It was a brazen plan to install his mistress into the very heart of my life, to let her walk across my rugs, drink from my glasses, sleep under my roof, maybe even sit at my table and use the dishes my mother gave me when I first married. The cruelty wasn't just in the cheating, it was in the assumption that I would swallow it quietly, that I would keep cooking, keep cleaning, keep smiling while another woman took my place inside my own house. I sat on the edge of the bed, the phone heavy in my hand, and I felt the kind of rage that is too deep for shouting. The kind of rage that turns into something colder, sharper, more dangerous, like ice rather than fire. I didn't confront him then. I didn't storm into the bathroom and demand answers. Instead, I slipped the phone back onto the counter and breathed. I thought of every sacrifice I had made, the promotions I passed up so I could be home for him, the vacations I canceled because his schedule was too tight, the countless times I had silenced my doubts to protect his image. And I realized at that moment that the very thing he underestimated, my silence, my patience, my calm, would become the weapon he could never see coming. I had always believed revenge was messy, reckless, destructive, but as I stood there in my quiet bedroom, the morning light spilling across the quilt my grandmother had stitched for me, I felt a new understanding wash over me. Revenge didn't have to be loud. It could be neat, clever, poetic. It could look like kindness on the surface and strike like thunder when least expected. It could teach a lesson without a single raised voice. So, I made a vow right then. I would not cry in front of him. I would not beg, and I would not fight for scraps of loyalty he had already thrown away. Instead, I would wait, I would plan, and I would choose a path that made sure he learned that betrayal has consequences far more humiliating than the thrill of secrecy. I wanted him to taste the very sickness he tried to serve me, to sit in the very discomfort he thought he could dump into my lap. That was the moment the story truly began. The moment the good, loyal wife became something else entirely, not a victim, not a fool, but a quiet storm preparing to break. For so many years I believed that the secret to keeping a marriage strong was not in grand gestures or expensive gifts, but in the small, steady things that added up quietly. The way I folded his laundry while humming to myself, the way I filled his thermos with hot coffee before work, the way I remembered to buy his favorite cereal even when I had to cut corners on my own list, and I told myself these invisible threads were what built a family. I thought of myself as the steady heartbeat of our house, the one who created the illusion of harmony that neighbors admired when they passed by our porch, the one who made holidays glow with lights and warmth, and the one who believed that patience, loyalty, and trust would always be repaid with love. Yet the longer I played that part, the more I felt like an actress performing on a stage for an audience that didn't bother to applaud, and slowly it began to dawn on me that maybe all I was doing was decorating a house where my own voice no longer mattered. David thrived in the shadow of that illusion, the man who walked confidently into office parties and charmed everyone with his polished smile, a man praised by friends for having such a devoted wife, when in reality what he gave me behind closed doors was indifference wrapped in condescension. He enjoyed the safety net of my devotion, using it like armor to protect himself from ever having to answer uncomfortable questions, and every time I gathered the courage to ask why he stayed out so late, or why he smelled of perfume I didn't own, he tilted the story back at me, accusing me of being suspicious, needy, or insecure. His tone carried that sharp edge that left me doubting myself, making me wonder if maybe I really was imagining things, and in that way my silence became his comfort, my patience his justification, and my willingness to endure became the soil where his arrogance could grow unchecked. I told myself I was keeping the peace, but in truth I was feeding his belief that I would never stand in his way, that I was too meek, too gentle, too invested in the image of a happy marriage to ever rebel against the lies that held it together. What began as harmless excuses slowly hardened into a pattern I could no longer ignore, a web of small betrayals disguised as busy schedules and harmless routines. There were business trips that always seemed to fall on weekends when family gatherings were planned, gym sessions that stretched suspiciously late into the night, phone calls that ended the moment I walked into the room, and receipts from restaurants I had never set foot in, tucked carelessly into his jacket pockets. Each discovery left me torn between anger and denial, because part of me wanted to believe the stories, to cling to the picture of the man I thought I married, while another part of me whispered that these weren't mistakes but carefully placed signs. I wanted to think that loyalty meant trusting him, that forgiveness meant strength, that if I just endured long enough, the storm would pass, but the truth was uglier. My loyalty had made me invisible, and in my invisibility he found the perfect shield to live a double life, one where my sacrifices propped him up while he handed his affection to someone else. It wasn't the lies alone that crushed me. It was the realization that my kindness had become the very tool he used to erase me. The worst wound came not from secrecy, but from audacity, from the sheer boldness of his plans, as if he had already decided that I no longer had any rightful claim to the space I had poured myself into. He didn't just flirt with danger in hidden corners. He plotted openly with his lover about moving her into my home, using the guest room I had painted with soft blues last spring, filling her schedule into his phone calendar like a business meeting, labeling expenses as shared costs, as though she were entitled to the same roof that my sweat and sacrifice had sustained. He left these traces not carelessly, but almost defiantly, as if daring me to notice, as if testing how far my silence could stretch before breaking. And in those moments, I realized that injustice is not always a single act of betrayal that knocks you off your feet. Sometimes it is the slow erosion of your dignity, the steady chiseling away of your place in your own life, until you wake up one morning and feel like a ghost, haunting the very walls you once called home, invisible to the man you gave everything to, reduced to a backdrop for a story he had already rewritten without you. That was the day I began to understand that patience had a breaking point, and mine had arrived. The confirmation came not as a slip of the tongue or a suspicious stain on a shirt, but through the cold clarity of his own preparations so detailed and arrogant that they left no room for doubt. On his laptop, which he often left open as if daring me to see, there was a folder blandly titled Household. Inside were spreadsheets that looked like any family's budget at first glance, but when I studied them carefully one evening, my chest tightened. I saw categories for groceries, utilities, and home maintenance, but then my eyes caught a new column labeled Shared Costs, with neat entries for cosmetics I didn't use, clothing brands I never wore, and restaurants I had never dined in. It was not just evidence of cheating, it was proof of intent, a plan to financially absorb another woman into my household as if I were nothing more than the help who would quietly foot the bill. What burned deeper than the numbers on a screen was the way he mapped it all out with the calm confidence of a man who believed he could never be challenged. There were reminders set in his phone about moving day, and a calendar entry labeled Honey Guest Room Setup, scheduled on a Saturday when he knew I would be away visiting my parents. I even found a to-do list he had scribbled on the back of an envelope, where he had written things like buy new linens, clear closet space, and in a cruel twist, explain gently to Claire, as though I were a child who needed to be coaxed into accepting the inevitable. The audacity of that line cut me sharper than any confession of infidelity because it told me he had already decided that my voice, my outrage, my dignity, none of it would matter. He had reduced me to a predictable obstacle, one he believed could be pushed aside with a condescending smile and a half-hearted explanation. I sat on the edge of my bed that night, staring at those notes, my pulse racing, and instead of the tears he probably expected me to shed, I felt a cold rage forming in my stomach, a clarity that stripped away every illusion I had clung to. I pictured him sitting at a restaurant table with her, ordering wine I had never tasted, laughing in a voice that used to be reserved for me, and I realized that I had been living in a carefully crafted illusion, one that he thought would keep me docile while he rearranged my life without asking permission. I remembered all the times he told me I was too sensitive, that I imagined things, that I worried too much, and I could finally see those words for what they really were, not comfort, but manipulation, a way to make me doubt my instincts while he stripped away my place in my own marriage. The cruelest image came when I imagined her stepping into my home with a smile of entitlement, perhaps running her fingers along the banister I had polished, sitting on the sofa I had chosen, sipping wine from glasses I had washed with my own hands. It wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was invasion, a theft of my sanctuary dressed up as a new arrangement. I knew in that moment that confronting him with screams or accusations would only feed his narrative, would only make me look hysterical while he played the calm, rational man. No, I would not give him that satisfaction. Instead, I decided that if he wanted to stage a performance in front of neighbors and friends, I would make sure he became the star of a show he would never forget, a show where every smug assumption of control would turn into his deepest humiliation. The moment I found the calendar entry and the spreadsheets, my hands shook, but after the first hot wave of betrayal passed, a different kind of clarity settled in, the clear-eyed sort that arrives when you stop reacting and start seeing patterns. And as I replayed his habits in my head, I began to notice the small, predictable things he left behind, like a sloppy author leaving fingerprints on a manuscript. The same gym shoes by the door every morning, a travel mug always filled with coffee at 7, the way he left the guest room door slightly ajar on purpose, and the quiet little routines he assumed I would never question. And those routines were not just comforts. They were hints, regular rhythms I could exploit if I chose to. I started cataloging them mentally, not out of obsession, but out of purpose, The days he always left town, the way he preferred a certain brand of bottled water, the exact time he took his lunch break at the deli down the street, and slowly a plan clenched into shape that was less about vengeance and more about precision. Because when someone acts as if they own your life, the best response is to take ownership of the narrative, back with cool, deliberate moves that cannot be accused of melodrama. I also began to watch the neighborhood like someone learning the lay of a new battlefield, paying attention to small alliances I had never noticed before. Mrs. Carter next door, who liked her curtains closed but walked her dog at 5 precisely. Young Tom across the street, who recorded everything with his phone as if he were training for citizen journalism. And Donna, 2 houses down, who loved gossip the way some people loved crosswords, and who had a habit of sitting on her porch in a pink sweater with a glass of iced tea, eyes soft but observant, ready to catch anything that looked out of place. Donna, with her habit of photographing stray cats and neighborhood bake sales, became an unexpected asset because she kept a careful digital trail and had no patience for hypocrisy. And when you pair a meticulous neighbor with a man brazen enough to plan a lover's arrival, the odds start to tilt in favor of truth. I realized I didn't need to manufacture a scene. I simply needed to arrange circumstances so that the real scene, his, would reveal itself in daylight, and with witnesses whose testimonies would carry weight because they were ordinary people who noticed ordinary things. Another quiet truth I discovered in those days was an appreciation for how small acts of normalcy can be the most disarming. People dismiss a woman who keeps the house tidy and minding her own business, and that gave me an advantage because no one expected strategy behind my calm. I stocked the pantry with ordinary items. I wrote my grocery list in my usual looping hand. I packed his lunch with the same care I always had, and I fixed the guest room towels neatly in a stack as if I were preparing for simply a courteous visitor, not setting a trap, while all the while I took photographs, logged times, and saved messages that documented his intent without melodrama. Knowing that a clean, factual record speaks more convincingly than a tearful confrontation, and that when you combine proof with the public eye, humiliation becomes a form of justice that does not require shouting. I rehearsed my days so they looked like nothing had changed. I brewed my morning coffee, watered the plants, kissed a photograph of my father on the mantel because ritual steadied me. And then I moved through errands and work with the quiet purpose of someone who had decided to let consequences land on their own. So I began to prepare in small ways that felt almost domestic, folding linens and taking notes. But each folded towel and typed entry was a quiet act of reclaiming the story. I scheduled a dentist appointment late on the day he planned to be at the house with her, so I would be plausibly absent while the scene unfolded. I left the spare key in the same place I always did, so no suspicion would be raised if neighbors saw lights on and movement in the afternoon, and I made sure there was nothing dramatic in my behavior that might give him the satisfaction of claiming I was sabotaging him, because the goal was not to appear petty, but to let his own choices crescendo into an outcome he could not control. As the days narrowed toward the date his calendar had circled, my nerves and my sense of justice braided together into a steady thread, and even when doubt pressed like a thumb on my ribs, I reminded myself that measured, lawful exposure would be my language of revenge, not rancor, and that the most complete humiliation for someone who loved appearances would be to have their private mess become the neighborhood's morning conversation without me ever raising my voice. The morning of his so-called important day arrived quietly, the kind of ordinary weekday that would fool anyone else into believing nothing unusual was about to happen, and I moved through it with the calm precision of someone brewing coffee on autopilot, though in truth every move I made had a deliberate edge hidden beneath the surface. I placed the bottle of water he always carried onto the counter, the one he grabbed without looking as part of his routine, and I stirred into it the faintest dose of what he would never expect. A simple household laxative measured carefully enough to seem invisible, and beside it I prepared breakfast with the same tender touches I had given for years. Only this time, my tenderness had a new ingredient folded inside. I smiled as I buttered toast, scrambled eggs, and poured juice, not because I felt joy, but because I had realized that the sweetest revenge requires a steady hand and a face that betrays nothing. He walked into the kitchen like any other morning, towel around his neck, phone already buzzing with notifications, and I greeted him with the same warmth I had always shown, though in my mind I was already several steps ahead, picturing the scene that would unfold later without me having to lift a finger. I packed part of the meal neatly into containers, knowing he would take them for his lunch or perhaps share them with the guest he thought he was bringing into my house, and I kissed his cheek lightly as if nothing in the world had changed. The trick was not in grand gestures, but in the tiny, invisible shifts of intention, because betrayal thrives on blindness, and there was a certain grim satisfaction in giving him the blindness he had earned, only this time it would be directed toward himself. As I left for work that morning, my hair brushed neatly, my shoes clicking softly against the pavement, I felt the strangest combination of nerves and freedom, a mix of anticipation and release that steadied me even as my stomach fluttered with unease. I had no need to storm, no need to shout, because the house itself was about to reveal his duplicity, and all I had to do was step away and let the clock do the work. It was almost funny how ordinary the day looked from the outside, me driving to the office, him locking the door behind me, the sun rising gently over the neighborhood, children waiting for the school bus, and Donna sipping her morning tea on her porch, blissfully unaware that she was about to become a witness to a story more entertaining than any gossip column she had ever followed. I arrived at work and pretended to bury myself in tasks, but my mind was elsewhere, glancing at the clock, imagining the moment when his confidence would dissolve into panic, when appearances he guarded so carefully would crumble under the weight of an uncontrollable truth. I checked my phone once, twice, then forced myself to leave it face down on the desk, because I knew soon enough it would buzz like an alarm bell with calls and messages, and the sound of his desperation would be sweeter than any apology he could have faked. For the first time in months, I felt something close to power, not the kind of power that shouts or threatens, but the quiet power of knowing the story was shifting, that the same patience he had exploited in me had now transformed into the patience of justice, and that the day ahead would mark the beginning of his unraveling. By noon, my phone lit up with such intensity that I could feel the vibrations through the desk, a staccato rhythm of missed calls that quickly climbed from 3 to 9, then to 12, and each one carried his name on the screen like a desperate cry for help. Yet I didn't so much as lift a finger to answer. Instead, I let the sound fill the office air like background music, and every buzz was a reminder that silence can be louder than screams when wielded with intention. The thought of him sitting in my kitchen with his carefully chosen guest, both of them shifting from confident smirks to uneasy glances as the minutes dragged on, almost made me laugh, because I knew the trap wasn't in anything I did at that moment, but in what I had prepared hours earlier, when the day still seemed ordinary. It was Donna, my ever-watchful neighbor, who broke the suspense with a text that arrived like a cherry on top of the unfolding disaster. "Honey, something's happening at your place." Those words alone sent a jolt of satisfaction through me, because if Donna had noticed, it meant the performance had moved beyond private discomfort and into the public stage where humiliation blooms. And soon enough, the cul-de-sac was buzzing with whispers, heads turning as if the afternoon had suddenly gifted them front-row seats to a comedy they hadn't paid for. By the time she added a second message saying, "Police just showed up, not sure why, but looks serious," I knew the story had left my hands and taken on a life of its own, spreading faster than wildfire in dry grass, fueled not by my voice, but by their own shame spiraling in full view. When I returned home later that day, the moment I stepped from the car, I could sense the shift in the air, a thickness of curiosity laced with judgment. Neighbors peering from windows and pretending to sweep driveways while their eyes clung to me, waiting for any sign of how I would respond. The smell hit me first, sharp and sour, clinging to the air like a warning, and when I pushed open the front door, The sight before me was one I will never forget. Overturned chairs, stained rugs, a chaos of towels thrown desperately around, and in the middle of it all the shameful proof of his downfall, a scene no polite neighbor could ever unsee once the officers had stepped inside and shaken their heads in disbelief. It wasn't just a mess, it was the physical embodiment of arrogance crumbling into farce, and all I could do was stand there in quiet victory, my face calm, my pulse steady, knowing that every detail had burned itself into neighborhood memory. I didn't need to raise my voice or deliver dramatic monologues, because humiliation had already done the speaking for me, spreading through whispers, texts, and side glances, ensuring that by the following morning, every mailbox in the cul-de-sac would hold the same unspoken message. The man who paraded himself as respectable had been stripped of dignity by his own choices, and the woman he betrayed had not needed to lift more than a spoon to show the truth. Reputation, I realized, does not vanish in an instant, but stains slowly like wine on fabric, and no matter how hard he scrubbed in the days to come, the memory of that afternoon would remain etched into the minds of every witness. As I locked myself in the bathroom later that night, not to cry but to smile, I understood for the first time that sometimes justice doesn't roar with thunder. It arrives quietly on the porch of a neighbor holding a phone. That evening, after the neighbor's murmurs had quieted and the police cars had rolled away, I walked through the wreckage of my house, not as a broken wife, but as a woman cataloging the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, because while he scrambled to clean stains and hide evidence of his own humiliation, I moved with deliberate calm, snapping photographs of every ruined cushion, every overturned chair, every spot on the carpet that screamed louder than words ever could. I knew in that moment that proof was more powerful than anger, that a folder of facts carried more weight than any argument, and so I collected details like pearls on a string, each one destined to shine under the harsh lights of accountability. I placed the photos neatly into a cloud folder, labeled with dates and times, added screenshots of his brazen calendar entries, and backed everything up twice, because I understood that men like him thrived on twisting narratives, but a photograph doesn't bend and a timestamp doesn't stutter. With each saved file, I felt my shoulders straighten, as though I were sewing armor from pixels and paper, protection stitched from the very arrogance he had displayed so freely. For once, I wasn't the woman ironing shirts or preparing dinners. I was the quiet archivist of his downfall, and in my silence, I could already hear the crack of his pride under the weight of my evidence. When the mess became unbearable to look at, I packed a single overnight bag, tucking inside the essentials and one object that mattered more than anything else. The quilt my grandmother had made when I first married, a quilt sewn with patience and wisdom from a woman who knew that strength sometimes lives in softness. Carrying it out of the door, I didn't feel sadness but relief, as though the very walls were releasing me, and I drove to a modest inn on the edge of town where the lobby smelled of citrus, and the sheets forgave the chaos of the day. Lying there in the quiet, I didn't cry for what I had lost. I breathed deeply for what I had reclaimed, because freedom is not always a grand escape. Sometimes it is as small as choosing where you will rest your head at night without fear of betrayal beside you. He, of course, texted me even as I settled into the crisp, white bedding, messages filled with blame and accusation, claiming I had embarrassed him, as though I had dialed the police or summoned the neighbors, as though his humiliation was anything but his own creation. Reading his words, I almost laughed, because the irony was thick. A man who lived for appearances, now begging me not to let anyone know what had happened, when in truth, the entire cul-de-sac was already humming with the story. His panic was not my burden anymore, and as I turned off the phone and pulled the quilt up to my chin, I realized that revenge didn't need fireworks to be effective. Sometimes it is enough to let a man drown in the mess he poured onto others, while you, quietly, step out into fresh air and claim your own peace. If you are still with me, listening as this story unfolds, I want to take a moment just to thank you from the bottom of my heart, because your presence here means more than you can imagine. Sharing something so personal is never easy, yet knowing that you are out there, perhaps listening in your kitchen while stirring a pot of soup or sitting in your living room with a cup of tea, makes me feel less alone. If you could take just a second to subscribe, to leave a kind word in the comments, or even a simple like, it truly helps me keep telling these stories. Your support is what turns my pain into something meaningful, and it reminds me that we, women who've been through storms, are stronger when we share our voices. The morning after that chaotic day in the cul-de-sac, when the smell of shame was still lingering in my house, and the whispers had already spread beyond the block, David made his next move, a move that revealed the depth of his arrogance rather than his strength. Instead of disappearing quietly or apologizing, he stormed into the role of a man who saw himself as the victim, threatening me with legal action, claiming that I had defamed him and vowing to prove in court that I was the one who had caused him harm. His words were delivered with the confidence of someone used to twisting stories, a man who believed that if he shouted loud enough in front of the right audience, he could turn black into white and guilt into innocence. He filed a complaint that made my lawyer chuckle, a bundle of papers stuffed with exaggerations, half-truths, and accusations that painted me as a cruel woman bent on destroying him, conveniently ignoring the fact that it was his own choices that had lit the match. It was almost laughable to read the phrases he had underlined: emotional distress, damage to reputation, loss of standing, as though these things had been inflicted upon him by anyone but himself. What struck me most was his desperation to control the narrative, to rewrite the humiliating truth that had spilled into our neighborhood, and to demand that a courtroom restore the respect he had so recklessly squandered. But instead of shrinking under the weight of his threats, I felt a steadiness rise within me, because I had the one thing he couldn't manufacture: proof. I had the photographs, the messages, the calendar entries, the neighbor testimonies, and a story so clear that it didn't need embellishment. And so, while he prepared his speeches and ironed his suits, I prepared quietly, methodically, with the patience of someone who has already seen how arrogance collapses under its own weight. He wanted a spotlight, and I was more than willing to let him have it, because this time the stage was not the kitchen or the cul-de-sac. It was the courtroom, and the audience would not be forgiving neighbors, but a judge with no tolerance for lies. The days leading up to the hearing stretched out like a quiet storm waiting to break, and though on the surface everything about my life looked the same, I went to work, watered the plants on the porch, and greeted Donna when she waved from across the street. Inside, I was carefully laying out the foundation of my case, brick by brick, as if building a wall strong enough to withstand any attempt of his to twist the truth. Each evening, I sat at the small oak table in my room at the inn with my laptop open and folders spread around me, meticulously printing photographs that showed the disaster of that unforgettable day, labeling them with times and dates so no one could claim confusion. I slipped them into protective sleeves and arranged them into a binder, so precise it almost resembled a catalog, every page telling the story more clearly than my voice ever could. Screenshots of his messages glowed on my screen like confessions written in neon. The calendar entries smugly titled, "Honey, Guest Room Setup," sat printed in black and white, and Donna's statement, written in her cheerful but firm style, tied the whole picture together like a bow. With every detail I tucked into the binder, I felt myself stepping further away from the trembling woman who once doubted herself, and closer to someone steady enough to watch arrogance collapse under the weight of its own evidence. Even the smallest choices mattered to me then, because I knew that in a courtroom, impressions can tip the scales as much as facts. And so I thought about my appearance the way an artist thinks about framing a portrait. I chose a navy dress that had no frills but carried an air of quiet authority, with a hemline modest enough to suggest respect, but lines sleek enough to show I had not been broken. Low heels that wouldn't click too loudly on the polished floors, hair brushed smooth and tucked neatly, and a simple string of pearls my mother had given me long ago, not for glamour, but for remembrance of where I came from. My lawyer, a man with sharp eyes who had handled far louder cases than mine, reminded me that dignity would weigh heavier than dramatics, and that my silence, paired with evidence, would paint me as the woman who valued truth more than theater. I found comfort in that strategy because it aligned with what I had already discovered, that patience and restraint, once my weaknesses, had now become my sharpest tools. David, meanwhile, seemed to treat the days before the hearing as rehearsals for a play he believed he would star in. I overheard fragments of his self-scripted speeches drifting through the walls when he stayed at the house, words like malicious sabotage, vindictive partner, and emotional abuse, rolling from his tongue with the false conviction of a man who thought eloquence could replace integrity. He carried that same old gym bag, polished as if it were a briefcase, strolling through the neighborhood with a swagger that suggested he still believed charm could erase facts. I imagined him pacing in front of the mirror, practicing furrowed brows and solemn sighs, convinced that the court would see me as the irrational wife and him as the calm, reasoned victim. But arrogance is blind, and he could not see the trap forming from his own missteps, a trap that required nothing of me but patience, because his greatest weakness had always been his need to be admired, and in a place where admiration carries no weight, his words would hang hollow. The morning of the hearing finally arrived, and as I rose from the crisp sheets of the inn, I felt a steadiness I hadn't known in years. I brushed my hair slowly, smoothing every strand as if sealing away the old version of myself that once trembled under his accusations. I folded my grandmother's quilt, pressed it to my chest for just a moment of borrowed courage, then laid it neatly across the bed before picking up the binder that held every piece of proof I needed. Walking toward the door, heels in hand, I paused before the mirror, not searching for beauty, but for calm, and in the reflection I saw a woman who had been dismissed, silenced, underestimated, and yet now stood taller than she ever had. I tucked the binder under my arm like armor, slipped into my shoes, and stepped out into the cool morning air. As the sun rose behind me, painting the sky with gold, I felt no fear, no trembling, only the certainty that the stage he had demanded was ready, that the audience was already waiting, and that when the curtain lifted, the show would not be the one he rehearsed, but the unmasking he had written himself. The courthouse had the solemn stillness of a place built to strip away illusions, the kind of stillness that makes every cough echo and every shoe click feel louder than it should. And as I walked through its heavy oak doors with my binder pressed firmly against my ribs, I felt an unexpected calm, as though the building itself had taken the weight from my shoulders. The air smelled faintly of polished wood, aged paper, and ink, carrying with it a sense of permanence, a reminder that words spoken here did not drift away like gossip, but settled into records that would outlive us all. I sat quietly beside my lawyer, folded my hands in my lap, and let my eyes sweep over the room, the judge's high bench, the rows of spectators shifting in their seats, the clerk shuffling papers with detached precision. And then came David, striding in with the swagger of a man who still believed the world would bend to his charm, his mistress tottering a step behind in heels too tall for the occasion, both of them dressed in clothes that tried too hard to scream importance, as if they were attending a gala rather than a hearing. Their very appearance was a performance, bright ties and nervous smiles in a place meant for gravity, and it struck me that they looked less like a couple defending their dignity, and more like actors fumbling through a script they hadn't rehearsed enough. When the judge called the room to order, David sprang into action as though he had been waiting all his life for this stage, his voice smooth at first, carrying that familiar tone of false reason that he had used so many times on me. He spoke of cruelty and betrayal, painting me as a vindictive wife who had supposedly orchestrated an elaborate scheme to humiliate him publicly, sprinkling his speech with words like emotional torment, malicious intent, and calculated sabotage. He gestured broadly, pacing slightly as though the courtroom were his theater, his mistress nodding vigorously beside him and even dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she had clearly brought for the purpose, as though they were characters in a soap opera. But what might have sounded convincing in a casual conversation or to a sympathetic friend rang hollow here, bouncing off the walls of the courtroom like empty echoes. The judge listened without reaction, the clerk kept writing, and the few people sitting in the benches behind us shifted uncomfortably, their silence heavier than any applause he seemed to expect. I watched him with an almost detached curiosity, realizing that for the first time I could truly see his charm for what it was, a costume stitched from arrogance and worn thin from overuse. When my lawyer rose, the energy shifted instantly. He didn't raise his voice or wave his arms. He simply opened the binder with the quiet certainty of a man who knew facts speak louder than drama. Page by page, he laid the evidence on the stand like a string of lanterns, lighting a dark path. The photographs of the house after that infamous afternoon, carpets stained and chairs overturned, each image stamped with time and date. The printed screenshots of messages between David and his so-called honey, filled with casual arrogance and unmistakable plans. The calendar entry marking her move-in day with smug precision. The receipts labeled as shared costs that so neatly tied my bank account to his secret life. And then, as if to seal the case with a bow, he handed over Donna's written statement, simple and unembellished, describing in her own words what she had witnessed from her porch that day. The effect was immediate. The room leaned in, not physically perhaps, but with attention, every detail painting a picture more vivid than any speech could, and I could feel the balance tilt with each piece of paper. David's shoulders tightened, his mistress twisted her hands in her lap, and the confidence they had carried into the room began to drip away like water leaking from a cracked vessel. But the climax came in a way no one could have planned, a cruel symmetry that almost felt like fate itself had taken a seat in the courtroom. As the clock edged toward noon and David, still clinging to fragments of bravado, prepared to cross-examine the evidence with exaggerated indignation, I saw the flicker cross his face, a flicker I knew all too well. The sudden tightening of the jaw, the desperate shift in his chair, the look of a man whose body had chosen the worst possible moment to betray him. A heartbeat later, the same look passed over his mistress's face, and together they squirmed in their seats, trying to maintain composure, but control slipped through them like sand through an open hand. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp and echoing, not so much to restore order as to punctuate the irony that every pair of eyes in the room could already see. Two people who had strutted in demanding sympathy, now reduced to figures of ridicule by their own lack of control. Whispers spread in waves. A stifled laugh escaped from somewhere in the back row, and I lowered my gaze, not to hide my feelings, but to let silence carry the weight of the moment. I didn't need to smirk, didn't need to gloat, because nothing I could have said would ever echo as loudly as the sight they had given the world, a sight that would follow them far longer than any ruling etched on paper. When the judge finally closed the file and declared the case dismissed with a firm shake of the head, the silence in the room felt almost ceremonial, as though the walls themselves had been waiting to see pride collapse under its own weight. I rose from my chair slowly, gathering my binder with steady hands, and for the first time in a long while, I felt taller than I had ever felt before, not because I had won in the traditional sense, but because I had never allowed myself to be dragged into the mud of his theatrics. David and his mistress, once so eager to perform their roles as victims, now scurried to the exit under a cloud of whispers, and every glance from the spectators landed on them like arrows, sharp and unrelenting. For a man who thrived on admiration, on charm, on being the center of the room, there could be no punishment sharper than this walk of shame, and I didn't need to add a single word. His face told the entire story. As I stepped into the bright light outside, the courthouse stairs beneath my feet felt less like stone and more like a stage of triumph, and waiting at the bottom was Donna, who had taken the day to be present, her pink sweater standing out like a flag of solidarity. She hugged me tightly, whispering in my ear that the whole neighborhood already knew what had happened inside, and that by evening the story would be retold at every dinner table on the block. Her words weren't cruel, they were simply factual, because our little cul-de-sac had never needed newspapers to spread the news. For years, David had cultivated the image of being respectable, charming, the sort of man people trusted with small talk and borrowed tools. But now his reputation lay in tatters, and I realized in that moment that sometimes the greatest justice doesn't come from verdicts or laws, but from the simple honesty of community memory, the way people remember who you really are once the masks fall away. My lawyer, calm and professional as always, joined me with a satisfied nod and handed over the paperwork that officially secured my position, documents confirming that the house remained mine, that accounts were protected, and that restraining boundaries had been drawn so tightly that he could no longer use charm or manipulation to inch his way back into my life. I signed with a hand that no longer trembled, each stroke of ink a quiet declaration that I was no longer the invisible woman ironing shirts and waiting at the window, but the author of my own story. David lingered a few steps away, his shoulders hunched, his once confident stride broken into small, awkward shuffles, and the sight of him pulling at his mistress's arm, as though begging her to keep up, was almost pitiful. For the first time, I saw him not as a towering figure who loomed over my life, but as a small man diminished by his own choices, a man stripped of the very respect he had valued most. Walking toward my car, the binder tucked under my arm like armor, I couldn't help but reflect on the woman I had been at the start of this ordeal. Hesitant, apologetic, desperate to believe that patience and loyalty would fix what was broken. And I contrasted her with the woman I had become, someone who understood that silence does not mean weakness and composure can be sharper than rage. Balance had finally been restored, not through screaming matches or desperate confrontations, but through the steady power of truth revealed in broad daylight. And as I started the engine, the courthouse shrinking behind me in the rearview mirror, I promised myself that never again would I let anyone write me into the margins of my own life. Dignity, once reclaimed, is the kind of armor no betrayal can pierce, and in that realization, I discovered that real freedom doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it is as simple and steady as driving home with the windows down, breathing air that feels entirely your own. These days, my life has settled into a rhythm that feels not only peaceful, but almost luxurious in its simplicity, because I no longer measure my worth by whether or not someone else comes home for dinner, or whether my questions will be met with irritation. I cook for myself now, small meals that taste better than feasts used to, not because of the recipes, but because of the calm with which I prepare them. Sometimes I set the table with flowers from my own garden. Sometimes I eat standing by the window, watching the sunset, and either way, it feels like freedom. I even changed the Wi-Fi name to freshstart_24 and the password to "You can keep the gym bag," a private little joke that makes me smile each time I type it in. For the first time in years, my laughter rings in the house without being shushed or dismissed, and the silence that once weighed heavy has turned into a companion I actually enjoy. The neighborhood hasn't forgotten, and perhaps they never will, but the way they treat me now carries a different weight, one of quiet respect mixed with warmth. Donna drops off baskets of plums from her tree. Mrs. Carter nods to me with approval when she walks her dog, and even young Tom across the street, who records everything on his phone, offered to help me fix my mailbox after a storm. Their gestures may be small, but each one reminds me that I am not the woman hiding behind curtains anymore. I am the woman who stood tall when the world expected me to shrink. As for David and his mistress, they live in the shadows of their own making, and though I sometimes catch whispers about their struggles, I no longer waste energy on their chaos. Their names now roll through the cul-de-sac, not with admiration, but with a chuckle, the way people remember a farce, and nothing makes arrogance sting quite like becoming the neighborhood joke. I find humor in little things that once would have stung, and sometimes I allow myself to indulge in it. Like the day I passed the local coffee shop and overheard two women laughing about that courthouse fiasco, unaware that the quiet woman stirring sugar at the counter was the one they were talking about. Or the time I stood in the grocery aisle and noticed David avoiding the fiber section with a grim look, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing out loud. Life has a funny way of delivering its own punchlines, and though revenge was never sweet in the traditional sense, there is something deeply satisfying about knowing that their downfall needed no exaggeration. It was written by their own hands, and all I had to do was step aside and let it unfold. Looking back, I realized the most important lesson is not about punishment, but about reclamation, because when someone betrays you, they take more than loyalty. They try to take your sense of self, your belief that your voice matters. I lost that for a time, but I found it again in the quiet strength of patience, in the steady hand that chose proof over panic, and in the choice to walk away with dignity rather than stay and drown. The moral is simple and clear. Don't underestimate a quiet woman with a plan, because what looks like silence is often strategy. Justice does not always roar like thunder. Sometimes it arrives in whispers, in photographs, in small details that pile up until the truth can no longer be denied. And if you are listening to my story right now, wondering if you too have the strength to stand tall, let this be your reminder that you are stronger than you think and closer to your own fresh start than you know. And before I leave you, let me just say this from my heart. If my story touched you, made you laugh a little, or even gave you that sweet sense of justice we all secretly crave, please take a second to subscribe, hit the like button, or leave a comment telling me what part resonated with you most. It may seem like a small thing, but it truly helps me keep sharing these stories, and it makes me feel like I'm not just talking into the air, but sitting right there with you, friend to friend. Your support means the world, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, because every time you share a little piece of yourself, you remind me why I keep telling mine.